A suburban home, a symbol of love and safety, becomes the site of unimaginable horrors. Inside, a 10-year-old boy, once full of life and dreams, is found fighting for his life. His adoptive parents, entrusted with his care, now stand accused of his brutal murder. What happened inside those walls? How could a place meant to nurture become a house of torment? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, how did no one see the warning signs before it was too late? Welcome to CrimeByte, your source for uncovering the dark and shocking truths behind real-life crimes. Here, we don't just tell the story. We explore the lives affected, the questions unanswered, and the truths that demand to be heard. If you're as passionate about uncovering the mysteries of the criminal world as we are, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. By doing so, you'll never miss an update as we dive into the gripping and unforgettable cases that keep you on the edge of your seat. Join our growing community of true crime enthusiasts today. Today we bring you the harrowing case of a 10-year-old boy's tragic death at the hands of his adoptive parents. What started as a promise of a better life ended in unspeakable tragedy. Prepare yourself for a story of betrayal, hidden abuse, and the relentless search for justice that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Adoption is supposed to be a symbol of hope, a chance for a child to escape hardship and find a new beginning filled with love, safety, and opportunity. For this 10-year-old boy, it was meant to be just that. When Alejandra Marin and Juan Sanchez Moreno brought him into their home, it seemed like a dream come true. A family who could give him the stability and care he so desperately needed. From the outside, everything seemed perfect. A quiet home in Moreno Valley, a couple ready to embrace the joys and challenges of parenthood, and a boy full of life and potential, ready to thrive in his new environment. But appearances can be deceiving. No one could have imagined that the promise of a brighter future would turn into a living nightmare. The very people entrusted with this child's care, his adoptive parents, would become his worst nightmare. Behind the smiles and the facade of normalcy, cracks began to form. Neighbors would later recall seeing the boy outside, often alone, his once bright demeanor slowly dimming. But at the time, no one thought much of it. He was a quiet child, they assumed, adjusting to a new life. Yet behind closed doors, something was very wrong. How does a home meant for love and safety become a prison of fear and pain? And how could this child, so full of promise, fall through the cracks of a system designed to protect him? Alejandra Marin and Juan Sanchez Moreno seemed to be the perfect adoptive parents. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, kept to themselves, and presented themselves as a couple eager to provide a stable and nurturing environment for a child in need. To the outside world, they were unremarkable, a normal family living a normal life. But behind closed doors, the truth was far more sinister. Neighbors described the couple as quiet and reserved. They rarely interacted with others, but when they did, they were polite and cordial. No one suspected the tension that simmered inside their home, a tension that the boy felt every moment of every day. He was such a quiet kid, the neighbor says. I'd see him outside sometimes, just sitting there. He never looked happy, though. I thought maybe he was shy or just adjusting to a new home. Behind their outward appearance of normalcy, Alejandra and Juan controlled every aspect of the boy's life. What began as strict rules and high expectations soon spiraled into something much darker. Isolation, verbal reprimands, and a chilling lack of affection became the norm. For this 10-year-old boy, home was not a sanctuary. It was a place of fear. As investigators would later uncover, this wasn't a case of overbearing parenting. It was something far more sinister. Alejandra and Juan's control over the boy went beyond strict discipline. They isolated him from the outside world, cutting him off from any potential support system. Slowly but surely, they tightened their grip on his life, leaving him trapped and powerless. You don't eat until you learn to follow the rules, she says, her tone devoid of emotion. Neighbors would later admit that they had noticed small signs, moments that, in hindsight, hinted at the darkness within the home. But at the time, no one thought to intervene. The couple's reserved nature and the boy's silence made it easy to overlook the growing storm. He was such a sweet kid, but you could tell something wasn't right, the teacher says. He always seemed withdrawn, like he was afraid to speak up. I wish I had asked more questions, but You never think something this terrible is happening. How did two people entrusted with a child's care turn into his tormentors? Was this premeditated cruelty or a result of their own failings and frustrations? And how could the warning signs go unnoticed by those around them? The cracks began to show. In the weeks and months leading up to that fateful night, small but troubling signs emerged. Neighbors began to notice that something wasn't right. Whispers of isolation, strange behavior, and a boy who seemed to shrink further into himself began to circulate. Yet no one could have predicted the horrors unfolding behind closed doors. Neighbors would later recall how rarely they saw the boy outside. When he did appear, he often seemed withdrawn, his small frame huddled against the chill, even on warm days. He rarely spoke, rarely played, and never smiled. It was as if the joy had been drained from him, leaving only a shadow of the child he once was. He was such a quiet kid, the neighbor says. I'd see him out there sometimes, just sitting on the porch. He never looked like he was having fun. I remember thinking, why doesn't he go play with the other kids? But I didn't ask questions. I thought it wasn't my place. As the boy's demeanor changed, so did his appearance. Neighbors began to notice bruises on his arms and legs, bruises that didn't align with the scrapes and scratches of an active child. When asked about them, the boy would quickly brush off the questions or avoid answering altogether. What happened here? The neighbor asks softly. These were the moments that raised quiet alarm bells, moments that, in hindsight, painted a clear picture of a child in distress. But at the time, they were dismissed as the quirks of a shy boy adjusting to a new home. It wasn't until much later that the full extent of the boy's suffering became clear. Investigators would uncover a pattern of isolation, manipulation, and violence that turned a child's life into a waking nightmare. But even before the authorities stepped in, there were clues. If only someone had acted on them sooner. He was falling behind in school, the teacher says. He used to be so eager to learn, but suddenly he stopped trying. He'd sit there staring at his desk, barely responding when I called on him. It was like he was disappearing right in front of me. But despite these signs, no one intervened. No calls were made, no questions were pressed. The boy remained trapped, his cries for help silent and unheard. How did these warning signs go unnoticed for so long? And how many more children are suffering in silence, their pain hidden behind the walls of seemingly ordinary homes? November 21st, 2024, a night that would forever change this quiet neighborhood. A 911 call brought authorities to the Moreno Valley home of Alejandra Marin and Juan Sanchez Moreno. Inside, they discovered a 10-year-old boy in critical condition. What they found was so horrifying, it stunned even the most seasoned first responders. The boy's injuries were severe. Bruises, cuts, and signs of prolonged abuse covered his body. His breathing was shallow, his pulse faint. Every moment was critical, as paramedics worked desperately to stabilize him. Time was slipping away. For those who witnessed the scene, it was clear that something terrible had happened. But no one could have guessed just how deep the horrors ran. Despite the paramedics' best efforts, the boy's injuries were too severe. Shortly after arriving at the hospital, his fragile body succumbed to the trauma. His life, so full of potential, was stolen in the most brutal way imaginable. But the nightmare didn't end there. What investigators discovered next would send shockwaves through the community and haunt everyone who set foot in that house. The house itself became a crime scene, a grim testament to the horrors the boy had endured. Investigators found evidence of prolonged abuse, the details of which were so disturbing they left even hardened officers shaken. This wasn't a case of sudden violence. It was a pattern of cruelty that had escalated over time. As the investigation unfolded, the horrifying truth began to emerge. This boy, entrusted to Alejandra Marin and Juan Sanchez Moreno, had suffered unimaginable pain at the hands of the very people who were supposed to protect him. Neighbors were left reeling, their quiet community transformed into the center of a nightmare. How could such cruelty go unnoticed for so long? And why did it take a tragedy of this magnitude to finally bring the truth to light? The investigation revealed a harrowing truth. This boy's life had been filled with unimaginable pain. Every corner of that home, every object recovered, painted a picture of suffering that no child should ever endure. What investigators uncovered was not a single moment of cruelty, but a prolonged and systematic pattern of neglect, abuse, and torture at the hands of his adoptive parents. Inside those walls, the boy lived a life dictated by fear. Investigators believe that Alejandra and Juan ruled the household with an iron fist, using punishment as their primary tool of control. They deprived the boy of basic necessities, food, warmth, and comfort, breaking his spirit day by day. The boy's room, if it could be called that, reflected the neglect he endured. His bed was little more than a pile of scraps, his belongings few and worn. Investigators noted the stark contrast between his sparse space and the rest of the home, which was meticulously maintained. It was clear, this child was not seen as a member of the family, but as something far less. The evidence didn't just point to neglect. It revealed physical abuse so severe, it left scars on the boy's body and psyche. Bruises, burns, and old fractures told the story of a child who had suffered in silence for far too long. Food became a weapon in their arsenal of control. Investigators learned that the boy was often denied meals as punishment, forced to watch as his adoptive parents ate in front of him. It wasn't just cruelty. It was a calculated effort to break his will. Each item investigators recovered told a story. A belt used as a weapon, a spoon turned into an instrument of pain, and a notebook filled with heartbreaking pleas for forgiveness. This wasn't discipline. This was torture. This case is one of the worst I've ever seen, the advocate says. It wasn't just neglect. It was intentional, systematic cruelty. This boy didn't just slip through the cracks. He was shoved into them by the very people who should have protected him. But how did it get to this point? How did two people entrusted with a child's care become his tormentors? Investigators would later uncover chilling details about the couple's past and their disturbing methods of control. Juan's silence spoke volumes. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, he refused to acknowledge his role in the boy's suffering. Alejandra, meanwhile, attempted to justify their actions, claiming they were merely disciplining the boy for bad behavior. "We did what we had to," she says. "He needed to learn respect." But the evidence told a different story, one of calculated cruelty that left a young boy broken and alone. The question investigators faced was not whether the couple was guilty, but why they had inflicted such pain on an innocent child. The case that shocked Moreno Valley came to a turning point as Alejandra Marin and Juan Sanchez Moreno were taken into custody. Charged with murder and torture, the couple faced the full weight of the law. For many, this moment brought a measure of relief, but it also raised troubling questions. How could such horror have remained hidden in plain sight? And what drove these adoptive parents to such brutality? Their neighbors were stunned. Many struggled to reconcile the quiet, unassuming couple they thought they knew with the monstrous reality that had been uncovered. Interviews with neighbors revealed a mixture of disbelief, guilt, and anger. "They seemed so normal," the neighbor says. "I mean, they were quiet, kept to themselves, but nothing about them screamed monsters." Looking back now, there were signs, but none of us thought it could be this bad. How could a community miss the signs? How could these atrocities go unnoticed for so long? For law enforcement, the answers lay in the evidence, and in the couple's own behavior after the boy's death. From the beginning, Alejandra and Juan's reactions were telling. Alejandra attempted to maintain a facade of control, insisting that their actions were justified. Juan, on the other hand, retreated into silence, his refusal to speak raising more questions than answers. "We were trying to teach him discipline," she says flatly. "He was difficult. Sometimes you have to be strict to make them listen." But the evidence told a different story, one of deliberate and calculated cruelty. Investigators laid out their findings: years of neglect, physical abuse, and a pattern of behavior that escalated into torture. The couple's excuses crumbled under the weight of the facts. "This is one of the most disturbing cases our department has ever encountered," he says. "The evidence clearly shows a pattern of abuse that was both intentional and prolonged. No child should ever endure what this boy went through." For the community, the arrests were just the beginning. As the full extent of the couple's crimes came to light, neighbors were left grappling with their own feelings of guilt. Many wondered if they had missed opportunities to intervene, to save a life that was slowly being destroyed. "I heard yelling sometimes, but I just thought, families argue, right?" the neighbor says, their voice breaking. "I never thought it could be something like this. I should have said something. I should have done something." Alejandra and Juan now faced charges of murder and torture, their actions laid bare for the world to see. But for many, the question remained, what could have driven them to such acts of brutality? And how do we prevent this from happening again? The death of a 10-year-old boy sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community of Moreno Valley. A place once defined by its quiet suburban charm became a focal point of heartbreak, anger, and reflection. How could such a tragedy occur? How had the system failed this child so catastrophically? Vigils became a way for the community to process their collective sorrow, to honor the life that was taken too soon. They came together not just to mourn, but to seek answers, to demand accountability, and to make sense of the senseless. I still can't believe it, he says, shaking his head. I lived 2 houses down, and I had no idea. None of us did. It makes you wonder, how many other kids are out there suffering in silence? He was just a little boy, she says, her eyes filling with tears. He didn't deserve this. No child does. I don't know how this could happen right here, in our neighborhood. Tributes poured in from across the community. Tokens of love and remembrance for a child whose life was cut tragically short. But as the days turned into weeks, grief began to transform into something more potent. Anger. How did this happen? One woman asks, her voice sharp. How did no one see what was going on in that house? The system is supposed to protect kids like him. Where was it when he needed it most? We need answers, he demands. If this could happen to him, it could happen to any child. What are you going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again? This isn't just a failure of the parents, she says. This is a systemic failure. We have to look at the cracks in the system that allowed this child to fall through. It's not enough to grieve. We have to act. For the people of Moreno Valley, the boy's death became a call to action. His story forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their community, their neighbors, and themselves. How had they missed the signs? And what could they do to ensure no other child suffered the same fate? This is about more than one child, she says to the camera. This is about every child who has ever been failed by the system. We owe it to him and to them to do better. But as the community grappled with its grief and anger, one question lingered above all others. How many more children are suffering in silence, waiting for someone to notice before it's too late? The arrests of Alejandra Marin and Juan Sanchez Moreno marked the beginning of a legal battle that would captivate a grieving community. Prosecutors vowed to deliver justice for the boy, whose suffering had gone unnoticed for so long. But as the case unfolded, it became clear that this trial was about more than just punishment. It was about accountability, change, and ensuring no child endured such horrors again. The courtroom was silent as the charges were read aloud, words that painted a harrowing picture of the boy's final days. Marin and Moreno, once seen as quiet neighbors, now stood accused of unimaginable cruelty. Their defense? A weak attempt to shift the narrative, claiming their actions were merely discipline. But the evidence told a different story. Prosecutors worked methodically, piecing together a case that left little room for doubt. The boy's injuries weren't isolated incidents. They were the result of years of systematic abuse. Evidence of malnourishment, untreated wounds, and psychological torment painted a picture of a life filled with pain and fear. This wasn't discipline. This was torture. Our goal is to secure justice for this young boy, she says. He deserved love and protection, and instead, he was betrayed by the very people who were supposed to care for him. We owe it to him, and to every vulnerable child, to ensure that this kind of horror is met with the full force of the law. But the trial wasn't just about holding the parents accountable. It also exposed the systemic failures that allowed this tragedy to unfold. Child advocates seized the opportunity to push for change, highlighting the gaps in the system that left the boy unprotected. This isn't just about these two individuals, they say. It's about a system that failed at every level. Teachers reported concerns, neighbors saw signs, and yet nothing was done. If we don't address these failures, this won't be the last time we're here, mourning a child who should have been saved. The trial became a rallying point for those demanding reform. Advocates called for better training for caseworkers, stronger oversight, and more resources to handle the overwhelming caseloads that often result in missed opportunities to save lives. This boy was failed by everyone who was supposed to protect him, she says, her gaze sweeping across the jury. But today, you have the power to ensure he didn't die in vain. By holding these two individuals accountable, you send a message that cruelty and neglect will not be tolerated. Not in this community, not anywhere. Would the jury deliver justice for the boy? Would the system finally take a stand against the kind of neglect and abuse that had gone unchecked for so long? Or would this case become just another heartbreaking chapter in a broken system? As the verdict loomed, the community waited with bated breath. This trial wasn't just about punishment. It was about healing, about accountability, and about ensuring that no child's cries for help would ever go unheard again. This case reignited urgent discussions about the glaring flaws in child welfare and adoption systems, flaws that allowed a vulnerable boy to slip through the cracks. For many, this tragedy was a wake-up call, a stark reminder that the systems designed to protect children often fail when they are needed most. But what can we do to prevent this from happening again? And how do we ensure that no child endures a fate like his? We have to start by acknowledging the gaps, the advocate says, gesturing to a presentation behind them. The system is overwhelmed, underfunded, and frankly broken. Caseworkers are stretched thin, and red flags are often missed. Not because people don't care, but because there simply aren't enough resources to catch every warning sign. Understaffed agencies, overburdened caseworkers, and a lack of communication between key organizations have created a system that struggles to keep up with its most basic responsibilities. In this boy's case, multiple warning signs went unnoticed or unaddressed, leaving him trapped in an unsafe environment until it was too late. I can't tell you how many times I've had to make impossible choices, they say, their voice heavy with regret. You prioritize the cases that seem the most urgent, but every file on that desk represents a child who needs help. You're always asking yourself, what if I missed something? We need more than just reactive measures, they say firmly. We need preventative systems in place, training for teachers to spot early signs of abuse, stronger collaboration between schools, healthcare providers and welfare agencies, and policies that prioritize the child's safety above all else. One of the key takeaways from this tragedy is the importance of vigilance. Teachers, neighbors, healthcare workers all play a crucial role in identifying and reporting signs of abuse. But how do we empower them to act? And how do we remove the barriers that often prevent intervention? Fear of getting involved is a big issue, they explain. People worry about being wrong, about overstepping boundaries, or even facing legal repercussions. But the cost of inaction is far greater. We need laws that protect those who report abuse in good faith, and we need to educate the public on recognizing and responding to signs of neglect and violence. I heard shouting from that house, she admits, but I thought it wasn't my place to say anything. Now I can't stop thinking, if I'd called someone, maybe he'd still be here. This case became a rallying cry for reform. Legislators introduced bills aimed at increasing funding for child protective services, reducing caseworker caseloads, and implementing stricter oversight for adoptive and foster homes. But would it be enough? And would these changes come in time to save the next vulnerable child? For the people of Moreno Valley and beyond, this case was more than a tragedy. It was a call to action. It forced communities to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems they rely on and the roles they play in protecting the most vulnerable among them. This isn't just about fixing a broken system, they say. It's about changing the way we think, the way we act, and the way we care for our children. We can't undo what happened to him, but we can honor his memory by ensuring that no other child suffers the way he did. But will these efforts lead to meaningful change? Or will the lessons of this tragedy fade away, leaving the system and the children it's meant to protect vulnerable once again? This boy's story is a heartbreaking reminder of how far we still have to go to protect vulnerable children. His life, filled with promise, was cut short not by chance, but by a system that failed to see his pain, by neighbors who didn't know what to do, and by a society that too often looks the other way. His legacy calls us to action, to demand better systems, stronger safeguards, and a society that prioritizes the safety and well-being of its youngest members. His story isn't just a cautionary tale. It's a call for change. What do you think? Could this tragedy have been prevented? Could one call, one question, or one act of courage have saved his life? And more importantly, What can we do to ensure no child suffers in silence again? Thank you for watching CrimeByte. Your engagement is a vital part of these conversations. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping true crime documentaries that uncover the stories behind the headlines. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue the conversation. Together, we can fight for justice.